Have you ever felt that a promise from God was taking too long to be fulfilled? Have you ever felt the sting of doubt, the bitterness of waiting, to the point where all you could do was laugh at the impossibility of it all? Today, we delve into the heart of a woman whose life was defined by this very struggle. A woman who wavered, who made mistakes, but who ultimately became a pillar of faith for generations. This is the profound, human, and deeply moving story of Sarah and her journey of learning to trust in God. Our story begins not in the barren desert, but in a cradle of civilization, the magnificent and imposing city of Ur of the Chaldees. Here, amidst the grandeur of towering ziggurats dedicated to the moon god Nana and the vibrant hum of a society steeped in commerce and pagan ritual, lived a woman named Sarai. Her name, meaning "my princess," was a fitting title. She was the wife of Abram, a man of considerable wealth and standing, and she herself was known for a breathtaking beauty that turned heads and inspired whispers. From the outside, her life appeared to be one of comfort, privilege, and security. She lived in a sturdy house, not a fragile tent. She was surrounded by family, by the familiar sights and sounds of her homeland, a world where the rules were understood and the future seemed predictable. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity, a deep and silent sorrow permeated every corner of her existence, a void that no amount of worldly wealth could ever fill. In the culture of ancient Mesopotamia, a woman's value, her very identity and legacy, was intrinsically woven into her ability to bear children, especially sons. A child was not just a joy, it was a woman's contribution to the family line, her social security, her purpose. But Sarai's womb was closed. Year after year, month after agonizing month, the hope that flickered within her would be extinguished by the relentless rhythm of disappointment. Each new pregnancy announced among her relatives, each child's laughter echoing in the courtyards, would have been like a sharp stone pressed against a tender wound. She would have watched other women nurse their babies, her arms feeling achingly empty, her heart filled with a complex cocktail of envy, shame, and a desperate, unanswered prayer. Imagine the conversation she endured, the well-meaning but painful questions from relatives, the pitying glances from other women in the marketplace. Her barrenness was not a private grief. It was a public spectacle of failure, a perceived sign of divine disfavor in a world that saw gods in everything. She was a princess without an heir, a garden without a flower, a branch that bore no fruit. This profound sense of inadequacy would have shaped her view of herself, of her husband, and of the very gods her people worshipped. Her beauty, which brought her attention, may have even felt like a cruel joke, a beautiful vessel that could not fulfill its most fundamental purpose. It was in this state of quiet desperation, of polished appearances hiding a fractured soul, that the God she did not yet know was preparing to call her name and turn her entire world, and her very understanding of purpose, completely upside down. Her journey would not begin with a shout of triumph, but with the quiet, persistent ache of an unfulfilled life, a fertile ground for a miracle she could not yet even begin to imagine. Subscribe, activate the bell, and walk with us to the end of this journey. Your presence and support are so important for the growth of this channel. It was into this world of silent suffering and cultural certainty that a new voice broke through. A voice that was not carved into stone idols or chanted by priests in ornate temples. It was the voice of the one true, living God, and it came with a command that was as staggering as it was simple. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. This command was spoken to Abram, but its impact rippled through every fiber of Sarai's being. This was not a suggestion for a short trip or a business venture. It was a call to abandon everything. Imagine the sheer magnitude of this decision from Sarai's perspective. She was being asked to leave the city of her birth, the only home she had ever known. She had to say goodbye to her extended family, to the comforting network of relatives and friends who formed the fabric of her social world. She had to turn her back on the culture that, for all its flaws, was familiar and predictable. In its place, God offered only a promise, a whisper of a future that was completely unseen and intangible. He promised to make Abram a great nation, to bless him, to make his name great. But for Sarai, the woman whose primary identity was tied to nation-building through childbirth, this promise must have sounded both intoxicating and painfully ironic. How could she, the barren one, become the matriarch of a great nation? The request was an assault on all human logic. They were to journey without a map, without a known destination, guided only by the voice of a God they were just beginning to know. Every rational instinct would have screamed in protest. Where were they going? What dangers would they face? Would there be water, food, hostile tribes? For a woman accustomed to the security of city walls and a well-established household, the prospect of a nomadic life in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness must have been terrifying. The journey itself would have been an immense physical and emotional ordeal. The sun beating down relentlessly, the dust coating everything, the nights cold and filled with the cries of unfamiliar animals. The comfort of her home in Ur would be replaced by the rough fabric of a tent, the steady rhythm of city life replaced by the uncertain, plodding pace of a caravan moving through an alien landscape. Yet, in an act of profound and courageous faith, Sarai went. She chose to trust her husband, and through him, to trust this unseen God who had made such an audacious promise. She packed her life away, took one last look at the towering ziggurat of her past, and stepped out into the unknown. This first step was perhaps the most difficult, a testament to a faith that was willing to trade the tangible securities of the present for the invisible promises of the future. It was a declaration that the silent ache in her heart was greater than her fear of the unknown, and she was willing to follow the faintest glimmer of hope, even if it led her into the heart of the desolate wilderness. The journey of faith is rarely a straight line, ascending towards glory. It is often a winding path with valleys of fear and doubt. The land of promise, Canaan, was not an instant paradise. A severe famine, a devastating drought gripped the region, turning the promised land into a place of starvation. The very ground that was supposed to sustain them became hostile. Faced with the threat of death, Abram made a decision born of human pragmatism rather than divine trust. They would go down to Egypt. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world, a land of abundance made fertile by the life-giving Nile. But it was also a land of immense power, ruled by a pharaoh who was considered a living god, a man whose whims could mean life or death. As they approached this formidable kingdom, a new fear seized Abram, a fear not of starvation, but of man. He looked at his wife, Sarai, whose beauty, even after the harsh journey, was still remarkable. He knew that in a foreign land, a beautiful woman with a dispensable husband was a dangerous combination. Fear, that great enemy of faith, began to whisper its toxic logic into his heart. Instead of trusting the God who had called them out of Ur and protected them thus far, Abram devised a human plan, a half-truth that was a whole lie. He told Sarai, "Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake and my life will be spared because of you." Imagine Sarai's position. Her husband, her protector, the one who had heard God's call, was now asking her to deny their sacred covenant of marriage to save his own skin. She was being reduced from a wife to a commodity, a beautiful object to be used as a bargaining chip for his safety. Was she coerced? Did she agree out of fear or out of a misplaced sense of loyalty? The scripture is silent on her protest, but we can feel the weight of her predicament. She was now in a land of strangers, her identity stripped away, forced to participate in a dangerous deception. As Abram had feared, the Egyptian officials saw her, and her beauty was reported to Pharaoh himself. Sarai, the promised mother of a great nation, was taken from her husband and placed in the harem of a pagan king. The promise seemed to be in absolute tatters. Abram, in his fear, had willingly given away the very vessel through which God's covenant was to be fulfilled. He was rewarded with sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, servants and wealth, the price of his wife. But the God who makes promises is also the God who keeps them, even when his people falter. While Sarai was in Pharaoh's palace, helpless and vulnerable, God intervened directly. He didn't send a prophet or an angel. He inflicted serious diseases upon Pharaoh and his household. The message was terrifyingly clear. This woman is off limits. She is under divine protection. A terrified Pharaoh summoned Abram, exposed the lie, and in a moment of stunning irony, the pagan king rebuked the man of God. "What have you done to me?" he cried, before sending them away. Not just with their lives, but with all the wealth they had acquired. They left Egypt richer in possessions, but they carried with them the heavy spiritual lesson of their failure. For Sarai, this experience must have been deeply traumatic, a searing reminder of how human fear could so easily jeopardize divine destiny, and a powerful, terrifying demonstration of the God who would move heaven and earth to protect his promise. Back in Canaan, enriched by the wealth of Egypt but humbled by their lapse in faith, Abram and Sarai settled once again. The immediate crisis was over, but now a new, more insidious trial began. The trial of time. The dramatic events, the call, the journey, the famine, the rescue from Egypt, gave way to the quiet, unchanging rhythm of daily life. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months bled into years, then a decade. The promise of a son, of becoming a great nation, which had once seemed so imminent and vibrant, began to fade like a beautiful tapestry left out in the sun. The silence from heaven was deafening. There were no more divine visitations, no thundering voices, no dramatic interventions. There was only the sun rising and setting, the flocks needing to be tended, the meals needing to be prepared, and the ever-present crushing reality of Sarai's empty womb. With each passing year, the biological possibility of her conceiving a child dwindled, and the promise began to look less like a future certainty and more like a cruel, distant memory. Think of the psychological toll this prolonged waiting must have taken on Sarai. Hope is a powerful fuel, but when it is starved for decades, it can turn into the bitter ash of cynicism. She would have watched Abram grow older, his hair turning from black to grey. She would have felt the changes in her own body, the undeniable signs of aging that screamed the word impossible louder than the whisper of God's promise. Every laugh line on her face, every ache in her bones, would have been a testament to the time that was slipping away, stealing the very possibility of the miracle she so desperately craved. The promise was for Abram to have an heir, but it was Sarai who felt the daily physical failure of its non-fulfillment. She was the epicenter of this divine waiting game. Did she begin to question everything? Did she wonder if they had misunderstood God's call? Perhaps the nation he spoke of was meant to be a spiritual one, not a literal one. Perhaps the promise was conditional, and their failure in Egypt had nullified the agreement. The human mind despises a vacuum, and in the silence of God, Sarai's mind would have been filled with doubts, rationalizations, and the growing temptation to find a human solution to a divine problem. The initial, passionate faith that propelled her out of Ur had now been worn down by the slow, grinding erosion of unanswered time. She was living in the land of promise, surrounded by the evidence of God's provision in their wealth and livestock. Yet the one promise that mattered most, the one that was personal to her, remained agonizingly out of reach. It is in this prolonged season of waiting, this crucible of silence, that faith is either forged into unbreakable steel or it cracks under the pressure of human impatience. For Sarai, after more than a decade of this quiet torment, the breaking point was near. She was tired of waiting for God to act. It was time, she believed, to help God out. After a decade of waiting in Canaan, Sarai's hope had worn thin, replaced by a pragmatism sharpened by years of disappointment. She was now 75 years old, well past the age of childbearing. The divine promise felt like a locked door, and she was convinced she had found a human key. She looked at her Egyptian handmaiden Hagar. In the culture of the time, her idea was not scandalous. It was a legally and socially recognized custom. If a wife was barren, she could give her maidservant to her husband, and any child born from that union would be considered the legal child of the wife. It was a form of ancient surrogacy, a practical solution to a heartbreaking problem. From a worldly perspective, Sarai's plan was logical, strategic, and even selfless. She was willing to endure the emotional pain of watching her husband with another woman in order to build their family, and, in her mind, fulfill the promise God had given them. She approached Abram, her words a carefully constructed argument born from pain and impatience. "The Lord has kept me from having children," she said. Notice her phrasing. She attributes her barrenness to God, framing him as the obstacle. "Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Her proposition was a profound theological statement. It was an admission of defeat in her own faith. She was no longer waiting for a miracle from God. She was initiating a plan for God. She was shifting from a position of patient trust to one of active control, attempting to produce a promised outcome through human effort and cultural convention. Abram's quick agreement is also telling. The weight of being childless, of carrying this grand promise without an heir, must have been immense for him as well. He listened to his wife, and in that moment, the voice of her desperation was louder to him than the memory of God's voice. He agreed to the plan. This decision, made in the quiet of their tent, would send shockwaves of pain and conflict through their family for generations to come. It was a pivotal moment where human logic triumphed over divine trust, a clear example of how even well-intentioned plans, when they are born of doubt and circumvent God's timing and methods, can lead to devastating consequences. Sarai believed she was being a dutiful wife, a problem solver. She was taking action, no longer a passive victim of her circumstances. But in her attempt to seize control of her destiny, she was inadvertently sowing the seeds of jealousy, bitterness, and division right into the heart of her own home. She was trying to construct with human hands what God had promised to create with a divine miracle. And the foundation of her plan, though it looked sound by the world's standards, was made of the crumbling mortar of unbelief. The consequences of this choice would be immediate, painful, and a stark lesson that God's promises do not require human shortcuts. The human plan to help God yielded results with swift and heartbreaking efficiency. Hagar conceived. The very outcome Sarai had orchestrated to bring her joy became the source of her deepest misery. The moment Hagar knew she was pregnant, the dynamic within the household fractured. The Bible says that when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. The servant, now carrying the master's heir, saw herself as superior to the barren wife. Every glance from Hagar, every subtle gesture, every protective hand placed on her own swelling abdomen would have been a dagger in Sarai's heart. Hagar, who was once a subordinate, now held the one thing Sarai desperately craved, and she wielded it as a weapon of contempt. The plan that was supposed to bring a family together was tearing it apart. The home that should have been celebrating new life was now poisoned with jealousy, resentment, and a bitter power struggle between two women. Sarai's pain, now magnified by Hagar's scorn, erupted in a furious outburst directed at her husband. "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering," she accused Abram. It was a cry of profound anguish, transferring the blame for a plan she herself had initiated. She had offered the solution, but now she could not bear the consequences. She felt stripped of her dignity, her position as the primary wife usurped by her own handmaiden. Abram, passive in the face of this domestic turmoil, essentially washed his hands of the situation. "Your slave is in your hands," he told Sarai. "Do with her whatever you think best." He abdicated his responsibility as the head of the household, leaving the two women to fight their own battles. Empowered by Abram's words, Sarai's grief and jealousy curdled into cruelty. She mistreated Hagar. The scripture doesn't specify the nature of the abuse, but it was severe enough to cause a pregnant Hagar to flee into the unforgiving wilderness, choosing the dangers of the desert over the torment within Sarai's tent. This was the bitter harvest of their impatience. Instead of the laughter of a child, their home was filled with the silence of strife. Instead of unity, there was division. The attempt to create a family through human means had created a broken one. Sarai, who had dreamed of becoming a mother, had instead become a source of such misery that it drove another woman, pregnant with her husband's child, to risk death in the desert. This painful episode reveals the raw, messy, and very human side of these figures of faith. Sarai was not a one-dimensional saint. She was a woman wrestling with deep insecurity, jealousy, and the painful consequences of her own choices. Her attempt to fix her problem had only created a bigger, more painful one, a wound in their family that would fester for years and serve as a tragic reminder that God's promises must be received in God's way and in God's time. 13 long years passed after Hagar fled and returned. 13 years of raising Ishmael, the son of the flesh, the product of the human plan. Abraham was now 99 years old, and Sarai was 89. To any outside observer, the story was over. Ishmael was the heir, the fulfillment, albeit a complicated one, of the promise. Any hope for a child from Sarai's own womb had long since turned to dust. The dream had died. It was at this moment, when all human hope was completely extinguished, that God appeared again. His silence was broken, and his purpose was clarified with stunning power and specificity. This was not a casual visit. It was the formal establishment of a covenant, sealed with a sign, circumcision, and marked by a profound change of identity. God began by changing Abram's name. "No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." The name change was not merely symbolic, it was prophetic. Abram meant exalted father, but Abraham meant father of a multitude. God was speaking a future reality into the present existence of a 99-year-old man with only one non-covenant son. And then God turned his attention to Sarai, the woman who had laughed in her heart, the woman who had schemed, the woman who had waited in silent agony for decades. He did not rebuke her for her past failures. Instead, he elevated her. "As for Sarai, your wife," God declared, "you are no longer to call her Sarai, her name will be Sarah." Just like with Abraham, this was a change of monumental significance. Sarai meant "my princess," a title that was personal to Abraham, possessive. But Sarah means princess or noblewoman in a broader, more universal sense. She was no longer just Abraham's princess. She was being designated as royalty in God's redemptive plan. God was restoring her dignity, lifting her out of the shame of her past and anointing her for her future. And then came the words that must have seemed utterly impossible, the promise clarified beyond all doubt. "I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." This was the critical moment of clarification. The promise was not just for an heir, it was for an heir through Sarah. God was explicitly invalidating the human plan with Hagar. Ishmael was not the one. The miracle would come through the aged, barren, post-menopausal womb of 90-year-old Sarah. God had waited until the situation was so far beyond the realm of human possibility that when the miracle finally came, no one could claim any credit. It would be an act of pure, undeniable, divine creation. For Sarah, hearing these words must have been a whirlwind of emotions: shock, disbelief, and perhaps, for the first time in a very long time, a tiny, fragile spark of genuine hope. God had not forgotten her. He saw her, he knew her name, and he was giving her a new one, a name pregnant with a promise that defied all logic, all biology, and all the years of pain she had endured. Shortly after the covenant was renewed and their names were changed, a strange and holy event occurred. As Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent in the oppressive heat of the day, he looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. Recognizing them as distinguished visitors, he ran to meet them, bowing low to the ground in a profound act of Middle Eastern hospitality. He offered them water to wash their feet, rest in the shade of a tree, and a meal to refresh them. He rushed to Sarah, telling her to quickly prepare the finest flour for bread, and he had a choice: tender calf prepared. This was more than just customary politeness. It was a lavish and generous welcome. What Abraham and Sarah did not fully realize was that they were entertaining angels, and one of the figures was the Lord himself in a physical manifestation. As they ate, the divine guest asked a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Where is your wife Sarah?" Abraham replied, "There, in the tent." Then the Lord delivered the promise in the most direct and time-specific manner yet. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Inside the tent, hidden from view but listening to every word, was Sarah. And when she heard this proclamation, she did something utterly and completely human. She laughed. But this was not the joyful, carefree laughter of delight. It was an internal, silent laugh, a bitter, cynical scoff born from a lifetime of disappointment. It was the laughter of a woman who had given up on hope. The scripture gives us a window into her very thoughts, her internal monologue of disbelief. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Her reasoning was flawless from a human perspective. She was 89, nearly 90 years old. She was, in her own words, worn out. The natural processes of her body had ceased decades ago. Abraham was 100. The idea was not just improbable, it was biologically absurd, a medical impossibility. Her laugh was the sound of a heart protecting itself from yet another potential disappointment. It was easier to find the promise ridiculous than to allow that fragile spark of hope to be reignited, only to be cruelly extinguished once more. Her laughter was the culmination of every month of failed hope, every year of waiting, every prayer that seemed to hit a brass ceiling. It was the sound of the deep chasm between God's supernatural power and her own lived, physical reality. She had heard the promise before, and it had brought nothing but pain. Why should this time be any different? It was a moment of raw, unfiltered honesty, a moment where her deep-seated doubt, cultivated over decades, rose to the surface and expressed itself in the only way it could: a hollow, mirthless laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. Sarah's silent internal laugh did not go unnoticed. The Lord, who sees the hidden chambers of the human heart, immediately addressed her disbelief, not by speaking to her directly, but through her husband, Abraham. "Why did Sarah laugh?" he asked. The question hung in the hot, still air, exposing her innermost thoughts to the light. He then quoted her own cynical reasoning back to her, and say, "Will I really have a child now that I am old?" In that moment, the veil was torn away. Sarah realized she was not dealing with an ordinary traveler. This was someone who could hear the silent thoughts of her heart, who could see past the thick goat hair walls of her tent and into the depths of her soul. The gentle inquiry was followed by one of the most powerful and foundational questions in all of Scripture. A question that reverberates through the ages and challenges every human doubt. Is anything too hard for the Lord? This was the central issue. It was never about Sarah's age or the condition of her body. It was always about the nature and power of the God who had made the promise. Was he limited by human biology? Was he constrained by the passage of time? Was his creative power, which had spoken the universe into existence, insufficient to bring life from a barren womb? The question was a divine rebuke, but it was gentle, designed not to crush her, but to awaken her. It was an invitation for her to lift her eyes from her own limitations and to fix them upon God's unlimited omnipotence. Terrified at being so completely exposed, Sarah's first reaction was fear-based deception. She denied it. "I did not laugh," she said, her voice lightly trembling. But the Lord's response was simple, calm, and irrefutable. "Yes, you did laugh." There was no condemnation in his voice, only a statement of fact. The conversation was over. The point had been made. This encounter was the critical turning point for Sarah's faith. Her doubt, which had festered in the darkness of her heart for so long, had been brought into the light of God's presence. And in that moment of exposure, something shifted. The confrontation with the living God, who knew her secret thoughts and yet still reaffirmed his promise, began to dismantle the walls of cynicism she had built around her heart. The divine question, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" began to work its way into her soul, challenging her worldview. Perhaps, just perhaps, the God who could call a nation from one man and woman could also call life into her dead womb. Her laughter of doubt had been met not with anger, but with a question of infinite possibility. It was in this sacred, terrifying moment of being truly seen by God that the seed of a new kind of faith, a faith that transcends human logic and rests solely on the character of God, began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. Just as the Lord had promised at the appointed time, about a year later, the impossible became a reality. The laws of nature were suspended by the law of divine grace. At the age of 90, Sarah, the woman who had laughed in disbelief, conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. The decades of waiting, the years of shame, the pain of barrenness, all vanished in the miraculous cry of a newborn baby. Abraham named him Isaac, a name which means "he laughs." This name, commanded by God, was a beautiful and profound redemption of Sarah's earlier failure. Her laughter of doubt was now transformed into God's laughter of triumph. The name would be a permanent reminder not of her cynicism, but of God's faithfulness and his divine sense of humor. The very thing she had deemed laughable was now the source of her greatest joy. When she held her son in her arms for the first time, the physical, tangible proof of God's promise, the weight of a lifetime of sorrow, must have lifted from her shoulders. Her arms, which had ached with emptiness for 90 years, were finally full. Her home, which had been marked by silence and then by strife, was now filled with the sounds of new life. Sarah's own words capture the overwhelming, community-altering joy of this moment. She declared, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." Her private miracle was now a public testimony. Her personal joy was so infectious that it would spread to everyone who heard the story. The pitying glances from the other women were now replaced with shared wonder and celebration. The shame was replaced with honor. She was no longer Sarah the barren, but Sarah the mother of the promised child. Imagine the profound wonder of that first year. Every small milestone, Isaac's first smile, the way his tiny hand wrapped around her finger, the soft weight of him sleeping on her chest, would have been a fresh wave of miraculous grace washing over her. She was not just a mother, she was a living, breathing testament to the fact that nothing is too hard for the Lord. Her body, once a source of shame and disappointment, had become an altar upon which God had displayed his creative power. The birth of Isaac was more than just the fulfillment of a personal desire. It was a critical link in the chain of God's redemptive plan for all humanity. Through this child of the promise, a lineage would be established that would eventually lead to the Messiah. Sarah's laughter of joy echoed the laughter of heaven, a celebration of a promise kept, a faith rewarded, and a God who specializes in turning the impossible into a beautiful, laughing reality. The joy of Isaac's birth, however, did not erase the complex consequences of past decisions. The presence of two sons in the camp, one born of human effort, the other of a divine promise, created an unsustainable tension. This tension came to a head during the great feast Abraham held to celebrate the day Isaac was weaned. It was a time of immense joy and cultural significance, marking the successful passage of Isaac through the most vulnerable years of infancy. But Sarah saw something that deeply disturbed her. She saw Ishmael, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, mocking her son, Isaac. The original Hebrew word suggests more than simple childish teasing. It implies ridicule, persecution, and a challenge to Isaac's position as the true heir. In that moment, Sarah's fierce maternal instinct rose up. This was not the petty jealousy she had felt years ago. This was the righteous fury of a mother protecting the child of the covenant. She saw Ishmael's mockery as a direct threat to God's plan and to the sacred lineage. Her response was swift and absolute. She went to Abraham and demanded, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Her words were harsh, but they were born from a new, mature faith. She understood, perhaps more clearly than even Abraham at that moment, that the two lines could not coexist. The son of the flesh and the son of the promise represented two different principles, two different covenants, and a choice had to be made. The matter was very distressing to Abraham, for Ishmael was his son too. He loved the boy. But God intervened, affirming Sarah's perspective, though with a tone of compassion. "Do not be so distressed," God told Abraham. "Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." God validated Sarah's spiritual insight while also promising to care for Hagar and Ishmael. And so, in one of the most poignant and heartbreaking scenes in Genesis, Abraham sent Hagar and his firstborn son away, with only some bread and a skin of water, into the wilderness. For Sarah, this must have been a deeply somber moment, a painful but necessary surgery to protect the integrity of God's promise. It was the final, painful severing of the ties to her old life of doubt and human scheming. She was now fully committed to God's plan through God's chosen vessel, Isaac. Her faith had matured. She was no longer just a passive recipient of a promise, she had become its fierce guardian. This difficult episode followed later by the ultimate test of Abraham being asked to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, a test which Sarah surely endured with a heart full of anguish and trust, demonstrates that her faith was no longer fragile. It had been tested by waiting, purified by fire, and now stood strong enough to make incredibly difficult choices for the sake of God's holy purpose. Sarah lived to be 127 years old, a long life filled with the highest highs and the lowest lows. She died in the land of promise and was buried in the cave of Machpelah, the first piece of the promised land that Abraham would ever own. Her story, when we look at it in its entirety, is not a simple fairy tale of a patient saint who waited perfectly for God's blessing. It is the messy, complicated, and breathtakingly honest story of a real woman. She was a woman who knew the agony of unfulfilled dreams, who wrestled with crippling doubt, who laughed at God's promises, who schemed and manipulated out of fear and impatience, and who caused pain to others through her jealousy. She was flawed, she was human, and that is precisely what makes her story so powerful and so incredibly encouraging for us today. Her journey teaches us that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the choice to trust God even in the midst of it. Her life demonstrates that God's plans are not thwarted by our human mistakes or our wavering belief. He is a God of redemption who can take our greatest failures, our most cynical laughter, and transform them into a testimony of His grace and power. The New Testament, looking back at her life, does not focus on her moment of doubt in the tent. Instead, the book of Hebrews elevates her into the great hall of faith, saying, "By faith even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise." In the end, her legacy is defined not by her wavering, but by her ultimate conclusion. The God who makes promises is faithful to keep them. Sarah's story is an eternal promise to every person who feels their dream is dead, to every soul that feels too old, too broken, or too far gone. It is a testament that our timeline is not God's timeline, and our understanding of possible is not a limitation for Him. Sarah, the princess of Ur, the barren wife, the doubter who laughed, became Sarah, the princess of God's covenant, the joyful mother of the promised son, and the matriarch of nations. Her life is a radiant beacon of hope, reminding us to look beyond our circumstances, to dare to believe in the impossible, and to trust in the faithfulness of the God for whom nothing, absolutely nothing, is too hard.